Okay, so hello everyone. Today's video will talk about one of the chapters in US history. It is the eugenics movement. The American eugenics movement was one of the most active and extreme manifestations, inspiring aspects of eugenics ideologies and practices in Germany, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere around the world. While eugenics reached its peak in popularity during the Second World War, eugenics practices remained widespread globally until the 1970s and in many cases sadly continue today. So if you haven't really know what happened during the eugenics era in the United States, I hope this video helps. These are the key terms of the topic that we're going to talk about. And here are the guiding questions. You can pause to give you a glimpse of what we're going to discuss in detail. So let's first just provide a broad overview of the eugenics movement. First, it's essential to know the figures behind the movement. And there are two kinds of eugenics. There is positive and negative one. But we'll also look deeper on the negative one because it was endorsed by American eugenicists. And sure, we will talk about eugenics in America and how it influenced their laws. And the American eugenics movement was formed during the late 19th century and continued as late as the 1940s. And the American eugenics movement embraced negative eugenics with the goal to eliminate undesirable genetic traits in the human race through selective breeding. And how involuntary sterilization was legalized during the era, and whether there's a connection between the immigration laws and whether there's a connection between the immigration laws during the time. So we will also talk about the victims of the eugenics. We got Emma and Carrie Buck and Sarah Rosas Gracia. Okay, first of all, to understand the questions, we need to understand what eugenics mean. So the word eugenics comes from the Greek roots for good and origin, or good birth, and involves applying principles of genetics and heredity for the purpose of improving the human race. Though the term eugenics was coined at the end of the 19th century, eugenic practices have existed in societies around the world for thousands of years. Think back to your middle school history class, and you might remember that in the ancient military state of Sparta, weak or deformed newborns were killed, thrown off of the top of Mount Taygetus. Ancient Greek philosopher Plato famously proposed a state-monitored human mating and reproduction program to produce a guardian or ruling class. And according to the 12 tables of Roman law, deformed or otherwise monstrous children born into Roman society were required to be put to death. So eugenics, using unscientific ideas and immoral and unethical means, eugenics sought to solve the problems of society by eliminating the unfit and encouraging the fit to increase in number. So who are the people behind this eugenics idea? Here we have Charles Davenport and also Francis Galton. First, we're going to talk about Francis Galton. He was English intellectual whose body of work spanned many fields. So he was a polymath who dipped his hand into several subjects, including statistics, psychology, meteorology, and genetics. He is also responsible for identifying patterns in fingerprints and devising the fingerprints classification system used in forensic work today. So he's really a talented guy, and incidentally, he was also half cousin of Charles Darwin. So we know Charles Darwin was a British naturalist who developed a theory of evolution based on natural selection. He proposed the theory of evolution in his 1859 book on the origin of species. Later, this what inspired Galton. He became fascinated by Darwin's concept of natural selection, and then the process by which organisms adapt to their environment by selectively reproducing changes in their genotypes. Galton theorized that human characteristics such as intelligence were heritable traits and That society, with its tendency to protect the weak, was preventing natural selection in humans. And in 1883, Galton coined the term eugenics, literally meaning good birth. And within the next few decades, the theory took off with academics and policymakers alike, particularly in the United States. And then here we have Charles Davenport. He was the man behind American eugenics. He was an American biologist, and in the early 20th century, Davenport expanded Sir Francis Galton's work in heredity. So Davenport and Galton believed selective breeding could transform the human race. Davenport came to believe that there are human genetics, strains of vipers, of sex offenders, strains with strong tendencies toward larceny, assault, lying, and etc. So these eugenicists believed that they could improve society by ensuring that only desirable traits were passed down. Here's the thing, their definition of what traits were and were not desirable was largely determined by the prejudice of their era. As I mentioned previously, there was positive eugenics, and there were two types of eugenics. This positive eugenics had the goal of improving the human race by encouraging those with desirable traits to breed. Positive eugenics was supported by British eugenicists as it encompassed a Galton's viewpoint, and this included manners and measures taken to incentivize the breeding of the so-called fit, such as better babies contests, fitter family contests, marriage counseling, encourage of the reproduction of the fit, and medals and certificates given to those typically white middle class Americans who were viewed as fit and in need of having more children. In contrast, negative eugenics focused on reducing degenerate offspring by preventing those that had undesirable traits from breeding. They were basically controlling the reproduction of the quote-unquote unfit. So we know that positive eugenics was supported by British eugenicists as it encompassed Galton's viewpoint, and for this negative eugenics, it was endorsed by American eugenicists. Negative eugenics was based on the degeneracy theory sourced in the idea that unfit people are from poor environments and damaged heredity. However, American eugenics focused mainly on the hereditary component rather than the environment, and American eugenists believed that degenerate behaviors such as alcoholism, poverty, and social dependency were all caused by genetic defects. Around 1910, American eugenicists also became concerned with feeble-mindedness, which they used to describe people with low IQs, abnormal behavior, sexual promiscuity, criminal behavior, and social dependency. In the images here, you can see some of the tropes that were popular and helped to popularize eugenics in the early 20th century, which were ideas about healthy seed being sown and the financial and biological cost of so-called feeble-minded people and mentally deficient people on society. Negative eugenics sought to impede both the arrival of supposedly biologically unfit peoples to United States shores, typically through immigration laws and through marriage restrictions, and most pointedly through eugenic sterilization. In 1903, the American Breeders Association was founded to study the laws of breeding, with members including the lives of inventor Alexander Graham Bell and first Stanford President David Starr Jordan. And in 1911, John H. Kellogg, he was famous for the cereal, established the Race Betterment Foundation, and biologist Charles Davenport, funded by the Carnegie Institution and Harriman Railroads, created the Eugenics Record Office, or known as ERO. Field workers for this organization soon began tracking families using the data to establish pedigrees which outlined the inheritance of undesirable traits throughout generations. Meanwhile, eugenic principles made their way into the culture of the day, with families excitedly taking part in better babies contests and fitter family competition, akin to the judgment of livestock that one might see at a county fair. Many feminist advocates took on the eugenics cause, including Margaret Sanger, founder of the Planned Parenthood and one of the most well-known early advocates of birth control. In this slide, which was produced by Harry Laughlin, who was the superintendent of the Eugenics Records Office from 1910 to the late 1930s, captures the different policies and approaches associated with eugenics and across the continuum moving from segregation to controlling matings to sterilization and more. And in 1907, Indiana became the first state to pass a compulsory sterilization law for criminals, idiots, imbeciles, and rapists. Other states followed suit until at one point 33 states permitted involuntary sterilization of those deemed undesirable for procreation. In 1927, when the constitution of these laws were called into question, the Supreme Court upheld state compulsory sterilization laws, a ruling that has yet to be expressly overturned. As a result, between 1907 and 1963, more than 64,000 people were involuntarily sterilized under the U.S. eugenic legislation. Under this banner of negative eugenic, 33 states passed eugenic sterilization laws, starting in Indiana in 1907 and finishing with Georgia in 1937. It is quite striking to reflect on the fact that two-thirds of U.S. states at the time had eugenic sterilization laws on the books, and these were not repealed until the 1970s and 1980s. Under these laws, over 60,000 people were sterilized in the 20th century. A key component of these sterilization laws was that they focused on categorized and people who ostensibly had disabilities. Disability served as an ideological linchpin in all of the aspects, in all of the states, and all of their sterilization laws. Suffice it to say that if you look at the key diagnostic criteria, as they saw them at the time for rationalizing sterilization, it almost always included the terms feeble-minded, as well as terms such as degenerative perversion, epilepsy, and deficiency. Thus, sterilization was not written primarily in racial or religious terms, but however, how it played out was it exacerbated existing racism, and one could argue expanded on racism and xenophobia at the time. Here you can see the data that California surpassed all other states when it came to eugenic sterilization, sterilizing more than 20,000 people, or more than one-third of all sterilization in the U.S. Virginia and North Carolina, Michigan come behind California, but they don't even match half of the operations that were performed there. And this sterilization took place in about 10 different mental institutions, some of which were founded in the late 19th century and others were founded in the mid 20th century. As you see from this slide, they really spread across the state from Southland and the Patton State Hospital in Pacific Colony up to Northern California, including Sonoma and Mendocino. Around this time, eugenicists also lobbied for stricter federal laws, particularly regarding immigration. So Congress passed America's first naturalization law in 1790. It limited the privilege of U.S. citizenship to free white persons, and about a century later, immigration laws began to restrict who could enter the country. The 1882 Act to regulate immigration prohibited entry to any person unable to take care of himself or herself without becoming a public charge. The law was designed to exclude immigrant whose undesirable conditions might prove costly to society, including convicted criminals, the poor, and the mentally ill. And in the same year, the Chinese Exclusion Act was the first measure to specifically target immigrants by race or ethnicity. In the 1890s, the federal government assumed sole jurisdiction to monitor immigration, a task that had previously been delegated by contrast to states with port cities, and the government built a depot on Ellis Island in New York Harbor, through which all immigrants were to be processed. Pressures for further immigration restrictions arose from several quarters of American society. Advocates for American workers wanted to forestall competition from cheap foreign labor, and the Boston-based immigration restriction league joined this chorus of alarm with calls to require a literacy test as a condition of entry into the United States. The sheer number of new arrivals troubled many U.S. citizens, and in the late 1870s, the annual average um, immigrant fell just short of 150,000, and by the turn of the century, the number had increased to almost 800,000, and in 1907, it passed 11 per 4 millions. And as the numbers of immigrants increased, eugenicists allied themselves with other interest groups to provide biological arguments to support immigration restriction. In 1911, Immigration Restriction League President Prescott Hall asked his former Harvard classmate Charles Davenport of the Eugenics Record Office for assistance to influence congressional debate on immigration. Davenport recommended a survey to determine the national origins of the hereditary defectives in American prisons, mental hospitals, and other charitable institutions. Davenport appointed ERO College Harry Laughlin to manage the research program. The Public Health Service, PHS, whose duties included performing medical inspections of disembarking passengers at Ellis Island, also adopted eugenic arguments to help stem the flood of quote-unquote inferior stock represented by the new immigrants. Beginning in 1914, the Surgeon General and a number of senior officers in the Public Health Service became publicly aligned with the eugenics movement. They took prominent roles in eugenic organization and published articles to support the eugenicist position in the immigration restriction debate. The key role of public health service physicians as medical guardian of U.S. ports, particularly at Ellis Island, gave the public health service additional credibility. And without specific support from eugenicists, by 1917, Congress had expanded the legal definition of those likely to become a public charge to include all idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded, epileptics, insane person of constitutional psychopathic inferiority, and mentally or physically defective. Later, involvement of eugenicists further broadened that definition by specifying that immigrant groups most likely to represent what Laughlin called the socially inadequate. In 1920, Laughlin appeared before the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Immigration and Naturalization, using data for the U.S. Census Bureau and a survey of the number of foreign-born persons in jails, prisons, and reformatories. He argued that the American gene pool was being polluted by a rising tide of intellectually and morally defective immigrants, primarily from Eastern and Southern Europe. Sympathetic to Laughlin's message, Committee Chairman Albert Johnson of Washington State appointed Laughlin as expert eugenics agent. And in this capacity, Laughlin conducted research from 1921 to 1931. He took a fact-finding trip to Europe, used free postage to conduct large-scale surveys of charitable institutions and mental hospitals, and had his result published by the government printing office. His research culminated in his 1924 testimony to Congress in support of a eugenically crafted immigration restriction bill, and the Eugenics Research Association displayed a chart beneath the rotunda of the Capitol building in Washington, showing the cost to taxpayers of supporting Laughlin's social inadequate. The resulting law, the Immigration Restriction Act of 1924, was designed consciously to halt the immigration of supposedly Dacianic Italians and Eastern European Jews, whose numbers had mushroomed during the period from 19 to 1920. The method was simply to scale the number of immigrants from each country in proportion to their percentage of the US population in the 1890 census, when Northern and Western Europeans were the dominant immigrants. Under the new law, the quota of Southern and Eastern Europeans was reduced from 45% to 15%, and the 1924 Act ended the greatest era of immigration in US history. So, upon signing the act, President Calvin Coolidge commented, America must remain America. America must remain Americans. This phrase would become the rallying cry of anti-immigration sentiment until after World War II, and the eugenic intent of the 1924 law and the quota system it established remained in place until they were repealed by the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965. Here we have Emma and Carrie Buck as the victims of sterilization in eugenics era. So Carrie Buck was born in 1906 in Charlottesville, Virginia. Soon afterward, her father either abandoned the family or died. There's no reliable record about that. And leaving Carrie and her mother Emma in dire poverty. And as a toddler, Carrie was taken in with the approval of municipal court by a well-to-do couple, John and Alice Dobbs, who asked to become her foster parents after seeing Emma on the street. And Carrie lived with the Dobbs and went to school through the 6th grade, and after which they put her out of school so that she could do housework full-time. She cleaned their house and was hired out to clean neighbors' homes. Until at 17, she was discovered to be pregnant, and she later said that she had been raped by Alice Dobbs' nephew, at which point her guardians moved to have her declared mentally deficient, although there was no prior evidence that this was the case. And they then had her committed to the Virginia colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. And when Carrie was sent to the Virginia colony in 1924, the forward thinkers of America were preoccupied by the imagined genetic threat of feeble-mindedness, a capaciously defined condition that was diagnosed using often flawed intelligence tests and by identifying symptoms such as moral degeneracy and overactive sex drive and other traits liberally ascribed to poor people, especially poor women, who were seen as having stepped out of line. So in Virginia colony, Carrie Buck was sterilized in October 1927. Next, we have Sarah Rosas Garcia and her daughter Andrea Garcia. And as a new widow, Sarah Rosas Garcia was already struggling to support her 9 children when her oldest daughter was picked up by the local authorities. Andrea Garcia had been accused of skipping school and being sexually promiscuous, so that the authorities responsible for juvenile delinquents committed her to a state hospital. And after being administered an IQ test and assigned a low score, the doctors made their verdict. They told Sarah her 19-year-old daughter would be sterilized to prevent passing on what the state saw as a mental deficiency. And with the help of famed civil rights lawyer David Marcus, Andrea's mother argued that California's sterilization law violated the U.S. Constitution, depriving Andrea of her rights to equal protection under the law. However, while one of the 3 judges overseeing the case voted to spare Andrea, the other two did not. And records suggest it's possible Andrea escaped the impending surgery, but many more victims of these policies did not. So, to end this presentation, we need to answer the guiding questions that I have mentioned in the introduction. Was eugenics a national attempt to engage in ethnic cleansing? And is it important for Americans to know about eugenics and this chapter of American history? So, the prejudices of their era largely determined their definition of fit. Entire categories of people were considered unfit for reproduction, including immigrants, people of color, and people with disabilities. Meanwhile, their ideal genetic standard reflected the movement's member, white Europeans of Nordic or Anglo-Saxon descent. Here we know that the bigotry that gave rise to eugenics was never really about science. It's blatant racism, and the label was typically applied based on superficial mental health diagnosis, and the results of IQ tests were linguistically and culturally biased against most immigrant population. Moreover, 33 states permitted involuntary sterilization of those deemed undesirable for procreation, proving that there was a national attempt to engage in ethnic cleansing. So yeah, there was a national attempt to engage in ethnic cleansing in this eugenics movement. And so is it important for Americans to know about eugenics and these chapters of American history? Well, many educational institutions still avoid discussing the history of eugenics, and many are reluctant to confront their complicity in the abuses it facilitated. The idea that those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it, so it's very troubling that we don't remember this past. So it is important to know about eugenics and this chapter of American history because studying eugenics in the 20th century is essential, not just as a matter of learning history, but also as part of what we need to know to consider the responsible uses of genetic technologies thoughtfully. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching, and take care, everyone, and also happy 4th of July. Bye bye.